My name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library in Ovid, New York. This interview is being conducted as part of the Cayuga and Seneca Lakes Agriculture and Craft Beverage Memory Project. Today is April 8, 2021, and I am interviewing Bruce Reisch, grapevine breeding and genetics at Cornell AgriTech in Geneva, New York. Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning.
Can you tell me your educational background?
Sure. I grew up in New York City. I went to Vassar College initially after graduation from high school, transferred to Cornell University, College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, where I obtained my Bachelor of Science degree in 1976 and PhD in plant breeding and plant genetics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1980.
And you began at Cornell in 1980, correct?
Right.
And can you tell me about what you do at the Geneva, at the Cornell AgriTech?
So I'm as a professor of grapevine breeding and genetics, I'm responsible for the applied development of new grapevine varieties that meet the needs of New York industry and beyond. And I'm also responsible for the study of the genetics of grapevines, and especially the traits that are important to growing grapevines commercially. So much of my work is in wine grape breeding and genetics, and some work also takes place in table grape improvement. And we study the genetics of disease resistance, the genetics of flavor chemistry, genetics of flower type in the vine. And all of these studies contribute to the development of improved varieties of grapes.
So since I read that there have been 14 new grape varieties produced since 1980, and using the tools of genetics for grapevine improvement. What exactly does that mean? How do you extract the chromosomes, I said, DNA of a grapevine?
What that means is that we use our knowledge of genetics. All of these varieties that we develop come from crosses between parents that we select. So, for instance, we can select parent A because it's really winter hardy, but maybe the quality of the wine isn't the best. And parent B has fantastic wine quality and disease resistance, but maybe lacks winter hardiness. So we make the cross between the two. The fruit produces seeds. The fruit that develops from the flowers produce seeds. The seeds are then planted, and we look among those seedlings for those that combine the best features of each parent and not the worst features of each parent. And some of that requires genetic testing. And that's where we've made the greatest advances in the last 15 years, is in growing these seedlings, extracting the DNA from these seedlings, and testing that DNA to tell us what traits we can expect as these vines grow. And we can make those decisions about which ones have disease resistance, and the right flower type to be self-fertile is really important. So that's where the flower sex comes in. So it doesn't require some pollen to drift in from somewhere else. The grapes are producing their own pollen, setting their own fruit, and the DNA tells us which ones will be more disease resistant. And that's a process we call marker-assisted selection. So this is one of the biggest contributions we've been able to make in the last 15 years or so, in having the DNA help predict the traits of the vines in year one, months after we start growing the seedlings.
Wow. And then, so it takes, how many years does it take to, generally 3 years to produce fruit on a grapevine? So how many years would it take just to test that? And I guess you would pluck out the vines that didn't do well, and then what happens? How long?
So in the first year that we plant a new crop of seedlings, which is right about this time of year, my greenhouse is full of thousands of seedlings right now. We've already extracted DNA, and it's just beginning to undergo analysis. By the time we plant those seedlings, late May or early June, we'll have eliminated 50 to 75% of them. Okay, the ones that then get planted to a nursery or directly to a vineyard, then we expect to see fruit in another 2 to 4 years. And then we start to select based on traits we're seeing and evaluating in the field, based on further laboratory tests, based on wine data that we begin to collect when there's enough fruit. That takes 5 or 6 years before there's the minimum amount of fruit to be able to evaluate wine possibilities. But overall, the process of testing the qualities of the grapes might take 15 years at the minimum in this area, and more often closer to 25 years.
Wow.
There are some times when it takes 30 to 40 years before a new grape actually finds its place in the industry. We learn something very late in the test phase, and then we're motivated to release a grape after 40 years of testing. So most of the time it takes to develop a new grape is in testing it beyond the confines of the research station, testing it in other states, testing with growers. You can't make a decision based on one single vine. You propagate, now you have 6 vines in our local testing. Then you need to plant dozens or hundreds at other locations to determine how is this grape doing under different environments and in different locations.
So at Cornell AgriTech, do you contact local vineyard owners and they sign up and volunteer for this process to plant? And how much of the acreage is planted or rows in the test capacity?
Sometimes we work through Cornell Cooperative Extension to locate a grower or growers willing to host a trial. And other times we distribute our numbered selections before we've decided whether to name them or not through 2 nurseries here in New York State, AA Vineyards and Amberg Grapevine Nurseries. And these 2 nurseries then make these selections available to growers on a trial basis in limited quantities, and then we seek their feedback, and we hope to learn from these growers how these vines will do. They will also distribute them to researchers in other states, and there's a formal testing process known as NE 1720, Northeast Project 1720, that consists of a network of researchers in many different states across the country. And when we make varieties selections available, they can go to the nurseries and obtain quantities that they need for their trials, whether it's in Indiana or Ohio or Michigan or Colorado.
And I noticed some of the grape varieties on your website have numbers and others then have names. Is there a process that...
So initially when we plant new grapes, they only have numbers, and they'll only be known by those numbers until they're assigned a name. So sometimes we're distributing these numbered selections in the process of trying to decide whether to name a grape. Like we have a grape, New York 81.315.17, and it's a hybrid of Cayuga White and Riesling, and it's it's probably going to be named early next year, roughly a year from now. But it's still just known as New York 81.315.17 until we go through the process of deciding upon a name and having an event where we formally name this variety. And then the Tax and Trade Bureau, the U.S. Federal Tax and Trade Bureau, can approve that name on their official list of grape variety names, so people can use that name on the label of a wine.
Okay. So, stepping back, how many grape varieties are there altogether?
In the world,
Yeah,
in
I
the
think I
entire
read
world,
60. Is that accurate? More?
many, many more.
Okay.
It's closer to 6,000 to 7,000
Oh my.
different grape varieties around the world. But much of the world is planted to like 80%. No, I'm sorry, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a very high percent around the world is planted to just 12 different varieties, like Cabernet Sauvignon and Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So those are very widely planted. But then when you come to Concord doesn't make the top 12, or Traminette, one of our most popular grapes from Cornell AgriTech, does not make the top 12 either. There are so many varieties. We used to think there were 12 to 15,000 different varieties, but with DNA testing, people have been able to determine that what's known as under one name in Spain, another in Italy, another in France, they're actually the same variety. So we've been able to distill down all the homonyms and synonyms to roughly 6,000 to 7,000 unique varieties of grapes.
And so why is a hybrid grape important? Why do you develop hybrids?
So here, well, if you start in the Finger Lakes, and what are the needs in the Finger Lakes or generally in New York State? Certain sites you can grow European grapes, you can grow your top-notch vinifera grapes, well known how to grow those and how they're adapted in different parts of the state, but you generally have to grow those in the very best sites. So, and they're very disease susceptible to begin with. So you have a lot of concern about losing them due to cold damage and having to take great efforts to control disease. And the hybrids fit in that market of still being able to produce quality wines, but with the addition of disease resistance and cold hardiness. So our varieties help extend the sites on which you can grow grapes with fewer concerns and fewer pesticides needing to be applied.
So wine quality and disease resistance and cold hardiness are something, the key points that you're looking for to develop a grape.
Those are some of the most important. Consistent productivity, and you can make grapes that are highly disease resistant and really winter hardy, but if they don't have quality, they're not going to go anywhere. So yeah, you need, those are the major three. But in the category of disease resistance, there are many diseases that we worry about and make efforts to ameliorate those diseases.
And what would those be? Which are the most dangerous?
Powdery mildew is the most dangerous pathogen around the world. Downy mildew in New York, with our humidity, moisture, the right temperatures for downy mildew. With climate change, we're seeing some other pathogens come in, like anthracnose has become more prevalent. There's a range of virus diseases as well that we're concerned with, and nurseries go to great efforts to eliminate these viruses from the stock they sell. Black rot is an important disease. It affects both the fruit as well as the leaves of a vine. But try the sponge rot is important. So sour rot, additional rots of the fruit. There's a long list.
Right. And I think I read that when you're experimenting with a new grapevine, you actually have contaminated soil. Is that accurate to say? Some of them, to see if they're hardy or resistant.
Oh, I think
How does that
below
work?
ground we're concerned about an insect called Phloxera.
Oh, right.
So Phloxera is an insect that is native to North America and Central America, and Phloxera is spread now pretty well around the world. There are very few areas from which Phloxera has been excluded. In this area, Phloxera is not super aggressive, but we plant our vines in soil that we assume is infested with Phloxera. It's generally infested in this area with Phloxera, some nematodes as well that can spread viruses. So we're doing our testing of hybrid grapes on their own roots without grafting.
Okay.
But when we get a grape like this New York 81 315 17 that grows weakly on its own roots, we then turn to grafting. And there are a range of Phloxera-resistant rootstocks that we can turn to so that we can get around any Phloxera susceptibility.
Okay. Well, I had a genetic mapping was one of the questions I had.
Yeah.
And you may have answered part of that already.
So, yeah, well, with genetic mapping, we have a process of mapping the genes on grapevine chromosomes. And we use these, if you think about a highway and exit signs and mileage marker signs on a highway, that's equivalent to mapping a chromosome. You need those signs to know where you are on the highway, and molecular markers are those little, like those mileage signs that tell you whether you're at mile 351 or 352 on the thruway. And if you know about what mileage marker exit 42 for Geneva is located at, you know how close you are. And so if you think of exit 42 as your gene for powdery resistance to powdery mildew, the mileage markers tell you how close you are to that gene. So we use what we call molecular markers to create these dense genetic maps. And the molecular markers are meaningless except they tell us how close you are to a gene. So we begin the process with development of a genetic map in different families of grapevines that we grow experimentally. And that leads us to the markers that are closest to the genes of interest, which we can then use to do this marker-assisted selection process.
That was my next question.
I was explaining to you a little earlier. So now we have markers that tell us, predict for us whether the flower will be perfect, have both male and female parts, or if it will be a female flower which only produces fruit and needs foreign pollen, or if it will be a male flower which will never produce fruit, only pollen. So what's desirable is a flower that's both male and female and will be self-fruitful.
So can you tell me some of the grapes that you have developed? I know I had read the Traminette being very, very important to the wine industry.
I think Traminette has been, at this point, probably the most successful grape of those that I've released. Chardonnay has also become very important in other states, not so much in New York State. But Traminette is grown commercially in Missouri, Michigan, Ohio, New York, Colorado, a range of different states. In the state of Indiana, where they worked closely with us to trial Traminette before it was named, my colleague Bruce Bordelon at Purdue University developed excellent data for the adaptation of Traminette to the state of Indiana. They eventually began to call this the signature white wine variety of the state of Indiana.
Wow.
So Traminette's had a pretty major impact on the industry. For a grower, it's productive, easy to grow, pretty disease resistant, and it's a progeny of Gewürztraminer. Wine lovers mostly know Gewürztraminer. It's not as well known as Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, but Gewürztraminer is a white wine variety from popular in the Alsace-Lorraine between Germany and France, but really originates with Traminer in northern Italy. Tramin, a village
Tramino.
Tramino, Italy.
Right.
And it's the spicy, Gewürz is spicy. So Traminette has the same compound, cis-rose oxide, that makes Gewürztraminer so unique. And it's just such a fragrant, aromatic compound. And a lot of people, when they may not know this grape when they first try it, but if you put the glass of wine in front of them at a wine tasting, many people love it. It's just done so well among consumers.
Yeah, Gewürz is so distinct. It's such a totally distinct.
It's won awards in many competitions, and a few years ago it was named the Outstanding Fruit Cultivar. It was given the Outstanding Fruit Cultivar Award by the American Society for Horticultural Sciences, where they recognize cultivars produced from fruit breeding efforts that have had major impacts on an industry.
I think I read 2015. Does that sound right?
I think so.
That you were personally acknowledged in that achievement. So that was 1996, the Traminette. Are there other grape varieties that you'd like to talk about that you developed here at Geneva?
Well, first of all, since it takes so long to develop grapes, Traminette and even Chardonnay, those were crosses made by my predecessors like John Einset. Bob Poole made the cross that developed into Aramella, and that was, I think, in 2013 we released Aramella. We're just a few years ago. So in that year we released both Arundel and Aramella.
I jotted down 2006. I don't know
2006.
I don't know if that's accurate or not, just in my notes, but probably not. So this Vitis Gen too?
No, I think 2006 was Noire, Coro Noir, and Valvan Muscat.
Okay.
Yeah. So Aramella is actually a cross of Traminette with Ravat 34. So it still brings Gewürztraminer forward another generation, but it's a really nice aromatic type with much more productivity, a higher yield than Traminette, and much more winter hardy too than Traminette.
So part of the focus in developing a new grapevine is sustainability. So that would involve using less pesticides. Is that accurate to say?
That's part of sustainability, and sustainability is how we take care of the soil, how we take care of the environment, how we maintain the soil from just washing away, not just clean cultivation is an element of it. But these varieties that we develop are much more adapted to either organic viticulture or sustainable viticulture because they're much easier for disease control. They have built-in disease resistance, and the newer ones have even greater disease resistance than the older ones. Arundel, for instance, was developed under no-spray conditions, and we'd recommend that it be grown with just one or two sprays of the most organic choice materials out there.
Wow.
And the newer ones are even more disease resistant than Arundel. Arundel, unfortunately, doesn't have as much resistance to black rot as we'd like it to have, But again, that's where we're making some progress with newer ones too. Newer ones have more powdery mildew resistance, more downy mildew resistance, just as much rot resistance as Arundel. And that makes all of these more sustainable,
Right.
easier to grow organically.
So in the past, maybe 20 years ago, vineyards had to use more pesticides, correct? How often were they spraying? And it's hard to say, but
It depends. Yeah, it would depend on what variety they were growing.
Like a Riesling, if they were growing a Riesling here in the Finger Lakes.
Riesling would often require 8 to 12 sprays per season.
Wow.
And growers might use a mix of different chemistries, and some might be formulations that you would use organically, like sulfur for powdery mildew control, or copper and lime for downy mildew control. But repeated use of copper is no good for the soil. It eventually builds up in the soil. Some people have allergies to sulfur. All applications require usage of fossil fuels. Every time you run the tractor through the vineyards, more energy is used. Energy is used to produce. Sorry, I got a catch in my throat. Energy is used to produce pesticides. So when you get to the older hybrids, they would typically be grown with 4 to 6 sprays per season, and the newer ones are probably going down to 1 or 2 per season.
Oh, so that's a very big difference. So can you tell me about, is it Vitis Gen 2?
Vitis Gen 2.
Vitis. I left out an I in my notes.
Right.
And so what is that about?
So Vitis Gen 2 is a USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture funded project. It started with Vitis Gen 1 in 2011. That was funded 2011 to 2016. Vitis Gen 2 takes us from 2017 to 2022. The first project was a $4.5 million, 25 investigator, 10 institution project. Vitis Gen 2, similar numbers of investigators and institutions, $6.5 million. And it brings the tools and techniques from DNA sequencing and the best in DNA sequencing technology to the use of all the public breeding programs in the United States. So I'm the official leader of both projects, though my co-leader is really a USDA colleague at Geneva, Lance Cadel-Davidson. And together we've put together these teams of investigators, of USDA scientists, along with university scientists, and even people with expertise in anything from plant pathology to grapevine extension to computational biology, the number crunching that you need to make sense of massive amounts of DNA sequence information in breeding programs. And together we've discovered new genes for disease resistance, new genes for wine quality traits. We've made progress getting to increase our understanding of the genetics behind cold tolerance, cold hardiness, early, middle winter, late winter hardiness that might involve delayed bud break.
Right, or early.
So
Problem.
Sorry?
An early bud break is, I know, a major problem from the other vineyard owners we've interviewed.
Right. So We've identified even some super winter hardy materials that typically have early bud break, and like Vitis riparia typically has real early bud break, but my colleague Jason Londo has discovered some individual Vitis riparia accessions, Vitis riparia plants that have much later bud break and still have good, excellent midwinter hardiness. So we've begun making crosses with those.
Wow.
So Jason Londo is also part of Vitis Gen 2. So together we've implemented marker-assisted selection in breeding programs across the country. We've implemented field data collection technology, imaging technology, robotics to assess powdery mildew resistance. That's a part of the project. New techniques for undertaking the marker-assisted selection technology that I've spoken about already. Lots of advances that are applicable around the world, but also to other crops. And they're first being applied in grape breeding because we're developing these technologies in grape breeding. So I'm very excited about this project. It's the best level of funding I've had in my entire career.
Oh, wow.
I get to work, I'm so lucky to get to work with these amazing colleagues at universities and research stations across the country. And we work together really well, and have made a tremendous amount of progress since the beginning of Vitis Gen 1.
Well, I usually conclude my interviews with the question to people, participants, but you have so many. What do you consider your greatest achievement? But it sounds as though you have so many that there's no one achievement that you have. There's just all these years at the Cornell AgriTech. I know the name changed recently. If you like to.
Yeah, I'd have to think about. I could not possibly name a single thing.
Exactly.
I am very proud of Traminette. I love going into wineries and not identifying myself. My wife usually outs me if they have a Traminette, but I try to just listen to other people tasting Traminette or Aramella, its progeny, and I so enjoy listening to people's reactions. Or once at a wine festival at Watkins Glen, people would walk by me up to a counter and ask the person serving wine for a particular winery, "Do you have a Traminette?" And it's just very exciting for me to hear that for a grape that just was known as New York 65 533 13 when I began in 1980.
Oh, okay.
I think the other. I would say some of the work I've done on genetic modification of grapes, that though it didn't produce anything of commercial interest, we were able to improve disease resistance through transformation technology, DNA insertion technology, and that's still something that many in the industry still consider important, though some don't want this technology. And I understand that too. And finally, the progress we've made in mapping chromosomes and implementing marker-assisted selection, and a recent, more basic discovery that I was a small part of in Vitis Gen 2, that the gene for perfect flowers, these self-fruitful plants, when all the wild grapes have either male flowers or female flowers, the gene for perfect flowers originated 2 different times.
Right.
So to me, that's exciting. That means 2 independent domestication events, because grapes were domesticated from the wild with the finding of self-fruitful grapes.
Well, certainly so many things to talk about. I'm sorry about the slight windiness here today.
It's nothing any of us have control over.
No, we're in the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, which
So-
I love being here. We get to live in this beautiful area, and we are just so lucky. I've had international visitors come and have no idea what it's like here, and they drive with me through the area, and they're just stunned. And we get to live here.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful place. I grew up in the area, so I'm always a big promoter of Ithaca and the state parks and our wine industry, of course. So I thank you very much, Bruce Reisch. And again, my name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. Today is April 8th, 2021. And thank you so much for your time and taking time out of your busy schedule.
My pleasure. I'm glad you asked, and so happy to talk to you.